Welcome to the Rampant Discourse YouTube channel. I'm your host, Paul Essen.
And I'm Andrew Riley.
I'm Travis Hudson.
And Travis, what are we doing today?
We are partaking in the Brewer's Advent Calendar of 2021, which hopefully you could buy one before they sold out at Costco.
So the Advent calendar is what here?
So it's 24 beers, because that's how long an Advent calendar is. 24 different beers from, and let me pull up my quick description, small breweries in Germany and Austria, and some of these are brewed and canned just for this calendar. So we're getting some exclusive beers here.
Nice.
We're going to start with beer number 1.
It's a bold move.
Yeah, that might be the way you want to start. So
today, beer number 1.
Yep. So we just yank it out and then see what it is. All right. We have the Grantler Hell, and I think Andrew's going to let us know a little bit about this one.
So the Grantler Hell beer is brewed by the Schlossbrauerei Herrengerstort, which is the brewery in the castle in the town of Herrengerstort in Bavaria. It's a Helles lager with 4.9% ABV. The Schlossbrauerei Herrengerstort claims to be the oldest privately owned brewery. They've been in operation since the 12th century, which is pretty incredible. As a Helles lager, it's a lager. It's a light beer. And when Americans think about light beer, we think, oh, it's the low-calorie, low-flavor thing. No. This means that it's not a dark beer. So you can see that the color here that Paul has just poured out is kind of a yellowish color. That's what we expect to see as beers, and that's because what we know of beers in America tends to be light Helles beers. Hopefully we'll see some Dunkels beers later on in the calendar, as well as some other types. The family that owns this brewery has owned it exclusively since 1899, with a short period where it was out of operation in the middle of World War II. And the most recent generation to take over took over in 1995. And I do want to take just a minute to talk about the Reinheitsgebot, which is the German purity laws. These are the laws that govern brewing beers. Beers in Germany can contain water, barley, hops. And that's it. So this is a beer brewed in that tradition, which means it's going to be very, very crisp. Most American beers are adding rice, which means it's almost sake. I might talk about that later on. But we're going to have a very different experience, especially from a microbrewery in Germany where they're still using these principles. You guys have poured yours. I'm going to pour mine, and you can start drinking and let me know what you think.
So I still have a significant amount of head on my beer. Would you say that now's an appropriate time to start drinking it, or should I let it die down a little bit more?
No, you want to have a head on it because the head will allow a lot of aroma to come through, and that allows you to experience the beer in its fullness. And that's going to, as I'm pouring, you can see that I'm pouring here at an angle. This is something that a lot of beer aficionados will snob at, and that's fine. They're welcome to snob at me. I like my beer.
You're disappearing there.
Wow, we got Ghost Andrew going on here.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. My background is taking over. I've got my comically oversized 1 liter 1 liter Stein here. I tend to like less head on my beers just because I enjoy the nose and aroma, but I also like to enjoy my beers usually over a longer period of time, which means I don't want the carbonation to escape early on. Prost.
Kampai. Yeah, not a lot of flavor. I'm gonna say it does seem like a light beer to me.
It is definitely a lighter beer. The first thing that I can taste is that there is a hoppier flavor than you're going to get from most American beers. That hoppiness is coming through right on the very first taste, and it sort of lingers. It gives us a bitterness, because hops have that bitterness to them. There's also more fruitiness to it because it has that, but the bitterness is the thing that's going to, this might remind you more of like an IPA, but with a much lower alcohol content than most IPAs.
So it's interesting you bring that up. You gave us the whole background about everything, but did you actually tell us that this is 4.9% alcohol by volume?
I think I mentioned that, but yes, it is 4.9% alcohol.
I wasn't listening.
Which is not a nothing, but it's relatively light. It's not a heavyweight beer here.
Right, which is interesting because you compared it to maybe an IPA, which I'm more comparing. which kind of makes sense to me since it's German beer. I usually equate German beers more with lagers and such.
Right. And this
That's
is
more what I'm getting at. It. This is like a crisp lager.
So actually, I have a couple of questions. Um, One of them is you mentioned the German purity laws and how they can only have water, barley, and hops.
yep.
Is that correct? So how exactly do they make different types of beer then with just those three ingredients? Is it different proportions? Is it different lengths of fermentation, or what? What's the deal?
Mostly different proportions, but also different varietals. So you have
Mm.
hops or barley, but if you get them in different areas and you process them differently, they're going to have different flavors. Hops are kind of like uh, wine grapes. Where you
Yeah.
grow them impacts their flavor tremendously. So the hops grown in this valley taste very different from the hops grown in this valley, which is just 200 feet away. Even though they're something about the alkalinity of the soil, it feeds right into those fruits.
Also, yeah, I was gonna exactly say what you just said. It's like grapes, and just like grapes, like hops, the same soil, different years is going to give you different profiles. Like a lot of the brewers in America got like a specific batch of, I think it was Galaxy hops one year, and they basically all had to throw their beer out because whatever that one batch was, that one year just wasn't very good.
Hmm.
And that does pose a lot of problems for mass production of beer, especially for commercial beer. The Budweiser wants their Budweiser to taste exactly like Budweiser every single year because that's what people expect it to taste like. You don't want the vintage kind of thing that you get with craftsman beers or wines. And so they have to do a lot of work to mute a lot of their flavors, honestly, because if they get too strong, uh, it's just not going to work out.
All right. So I said I had multiple questions. My second question is, why is it called Grantler Hell? And I say that because it says it's a grumpy German Helles. And again, this could be
Well,
something that you talked about when I wasn't paying attention. But
so Hella, I know Hellas usually has lager after it, so that's why I was already primed to think that this was going to be like a lager. So.
So German beers are going to be broken down into two broad categories. You have your Helles and you have your Dunkel. And so it's called the Grantler Hell because it's a Helles beer. Inside the Helles category, you have export beers, Helles beers, Kolsch beers, Maibach beers, Märzen beers, Pilsner beers, Spezial beers. And then under the Dunkels, which hopefully we'll get to later, we'll have Alt beers, Box, Doppelbox, Dunkels, Schwarz beers, and Keller beers.
I'm not going to remember any of that.
That's
I'm gonna
quite
be
a
honest.
under the Hellas. That's quite a range
Yeah,
from Kolsch all the way to Martins. Is kind of a runs the gamut a little bit.
basically, unless it's really dark, if it's
Yeah,
still a red, you're probably going to call it a Helles. And Helles just means light. Helles is light, Dunkel is dark. So a Helles beer is a beer that has a lighter color. Thank you, Paul.
yeah, a lighter in color, not like Michelob Light or Bud Light or Coors Light, where they're talking about
Exactly.
calories. Yeah,
Exactly. This is still a full calorie, full flavor beer, which I'm going to be downing very quickly.
So, not, in order to slow you down a little bit, Andrew, um,
Ooh, that's
we
pretty good.
well, I guess we know where you're going to rank at the end. But early on, you posed the interesting question to Travis about like, oh, what is this advent calendar that we're doing? You're a Catholic boy. What is an advent calendar? Like, what's the history behind that?
So
What's
that's
this whole deal with in
I'm on the spot
pop
there. I'm
culture?
not so familiar with it. I'm not
Oh
sure
yeah.
where the advent calendar comes from, but what it is,
chocolate industry.
yeah, probably it's a thing to help build expectation about Christmas up, because historically Christmas was Christmas Day, and then you have the day after Christmas, and the 12 days of Christmas are the 12 days after Christmas, not leading up to Christmas. So it's all the way up to Epiphany, which is this January 6th. So you have 12 days in between Christmas Day to Epiphany is 12 days.
Refresh my memory. What does the Epiphany celebrate? I
Epiphany
You
forget
is
have a
which.
when the
bright.
wise men arrived.
Uh,
Okay, I
So
was gonna say when you
that's
have a
when the
bright
gifts
idea.
show up.
Yeah. Okay, when you have a bright idea. Okay, so is that we're going down the rabbit hole on this one, but was Epiphany already a word and they named, you know what I mean? Like which came first? Was it that event named
the wise
Epiphany?
men or the word?
Yeah, and then that became what we know it in English, or
Put a pin on that, and maybe I'll come back to it tomorrow because I don't know off the top of my head.
all right.
But so if Christmas is Christmas Day and the experience of the Christmas season, which is after Christmas, then December's pretty bleak, right? You got the snowfall and it's cold, and if you don't have Thanksgiving as an American holiday and November is kind of bleak as well, maybe you want to spice things up and get some excitement for it. And so Advent is a period of preparation, and it's a penitential season for Catholics, which means it's one of those periods of time when we reflect on all the things that we've done that are wrong. If people talk about Catholics as the guilty religion, that's because we have two major penitential seasons. We have Lent, which is the one that everyone is more familiar with, but Advent is also a penitential season. Before we celebrate either Christmas or Easter, we remind ourselves that we need this redemption. We think about, but that's harder for kids, and I think the Advent calendars are really a thing for kids. Now, the Brewer's Advent calendar is obviously not a thing for kids, but it's a way for us to indulge in this as well. And a beer a day will keep something away. I'm not sure what.
The winter blues away. There you go. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, none of them are like, obviously they're not gonna have like a warm spiced cider or something like that in here. That would be, can't really put that into a package.
Well, so it's interesting. This is Travis, you said it was Austrian and German beers?
So yeah, it said all the beers are from small breweries in Germany and Austria.
So if Andrew's to be believed about his purity laws and everything, does that mean there's not going to be any like pumpkin flavored one? I mean, obviously pumpkin's not quite this correct season, but pumpkin is not water, barley, or hops. So can you not have flavored beers like that?
Usually the flavorings would disqualify it from being called beer, and I do suspect that we'll have things in here that are going to be called things similar to beer, but not called beer specifically. And it's kind of how you would avoid those kinds of requirements in the United States. If you say, in order to grade yourself as organic, you have to be going through these whole processes, right? Well, I don't want to do that. It's a lot of work. So I'll just package myself as pasture raised, and people will assume it's organic. You just change the wording around a little bit, and this alcoholic beverage that looks like beer, and it smells like beer, and it tastes like beer, and behaves like beer, that people will consider to be beer, I'm going to say it's near beer. It's near beer. And in fact, near beer is the thing that used to exist.
Well, and what's interesting is I was just listening to a beer podcast, and they were debating about when something can be called gluten-free, because that's a thing in beers also, versus gluten-reduced, and it has to do with like if anywhere in the process there was gluten and you took it out, even though the end product has no gluten, you can't call it gluten-free. It had to be gluten-free from beginning to end. But apparently I guess a lot of beer is gluten-free already. They just don't bother advertising it because it has like a bad reputation in the beer world, or at least did for a long time. I know we tried one like probably almost 10 years ago at this point. I think it was like Red Bridge or something. And I don't know if I finished the 6-pack of it, but I was like, I also don't need gluten-free beer. It's not made for me. So like, why drink it if it's not something I enjoy?
Right. Like, I think it's reasonable. I think most people would probably assume if you're advertising something as being vegan or sugar-free or fat-free or gluten-free or something along those lines, it's probably inferior in some way in terms of taste. I mean, fair or not, I think a lot of people have that in the back of their heads with a lot
Burn
of
to
stuff
vegans. I know what you.
I mean, I think that's true.
Something out instead of it being what you intended along the way. When you take something out, it's hard to replace what that brought with it. But if it was never there in the first place, then you haven't lost anything.
Right, yeah. Which is why they don't advertise it as gluten-free, even if it is gluten-free, because it was.
And you can kind of address that sometimes. I've seen like a naturally gluten-free food or something like that, where it's kind of stressing the fact that like, hey, we didn't do anything to make it worse. It's just naturally gluten-free, right? And it kind of gives that impression.
It's like water is naturally caffeine-free.
There you go. Not fluoride-free though.
Well, I mean, it depends on where your source is, right?
Yeah, that's true. City source or not, yeah.
Good old well water.
When we were house hunting 2 years ago, we ran into several houses that potentially had well water. Did not want to have to deal with that.
No, it's mostly a pain. Although you don't have to worry about fluoride in the water anymore, at least not as much. So if that is a concern of yours, you probably do want the well water. So maybe it's a feature for somebody.
After seeing how one of our friends has his whole system set up with like the water softeners and all that stuff, and he has to worry about that whole system, I was like, nope, I don't want to worry about that.
Yeah, hard water is a pain. I mean, It's bizarre too. Like it's just like this water isn't acting like it should be. What is wrong with it?
And that's another thing that goes into the beer as well. Where the water is sourced from will change its flavor profile as well. How hard the water is, whether it's mineral water or still water. So, getting to your questions, Paul, about how does three simple ingredients turn into so many different things. Um, so the Hellas versus the Dunkels, they're still just malted barley and
Hops.
hops. Thank you. this this is only 4.7 and 4.9. So it's not hitting me, I promise. So
You did chug it pretty fast.
I have drunk it pretty fast.
It's the size of the glass compared to you. That's what makes it.
Yeah.
So one of the ways that'll change the flavor profile is that the barley gets malted longer for the dunkels. So the malting process is all about basically toasting. You take barley and you throw it over a fire and you get it brown, the golden brown and delicious. So you toast it up a little bit, and what that does is it causes a sweetness reaction to occur. You burn it a little bit. It's like toasting bread. Toast tastes different than the white bread. It's not sweeter necessarily, but with barley it gets a little bit of sweetness to it, and it's allowing sugars in the barley to come out, and that's what
Is that like the Maillard reaction or the Maillard reaction or something like that?
very very similar. But you're going to talk about that for meats mostly.
Okay. Wasn't sure if it applied across the board.
It might. I mean, it might still be the same thing.
I don't want to waste all our beer knowledge in the first episode. Or cut you off.
Either way, go ahead. You got something. Let's go.
Oh, and now I probably just lost the thought. Oh no. So if it's right, so the ingredients are specified to be, like we keep saying, water, barley, and hops. But it sounds like you can do a lot brewing it. So like, are they allowed to age it? Like there's a lot of barrel aged beers nowadays where you take a bourbon barrel or a rum barrel or something and age your beer in it. I guess they would still be allowed to do that, even though it's modifying it.
So the Keller's beer style of Dunkel is very, very new beer. It's right from the cellar. Everything else tends to be aged at least a little bit, and that does change your flavor profiles a little bit. But beers don't change very much once they're brewed. They don't continue to ferment like a wine might after the processing, unless you set it up to do that. In which case, that will of course affect your flavor profiles, and that should be permitted. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. Like I don't know exactly how they barrel age beers, because usually it's like they brew it, they release it, and then like 6 months later, they're like, "Hey, we kept some in a barrel. Here it is. It's 5% higher alcohol now," type of thing. Usually is how it turns out. But
as long as those little microbes continue to eat the sugars, and as long as there's still enough sugar, they'll continue to convert it into alcohol and carbonation, natural carbonation. Some beers will have carbonation added as well, so you'll see, you have extra carbonation, but most of the carbonation is supposed to be part of the process where the alcohol is produced from the sugars.
Yeah, it's the yeast farting, right?
Yeast farting, exactly right.
Got Paul with that one.
You're making this beer sound so appealing. It's microbes in your beer eating things and yeast farting.
It's not just this beer, that's all beer.
Yeah. So we didn't really address this at the top, but I think at the end the three of us are going to be rating the beer with a simple kind of thumbs up, thumbs down kind of scale to determine what our collective ranking is. So without trying to tip our hand.
If we tip our hand, then we'll put our hand out and then we tip it one way or the other.
Yeah, but what's the saying? Without tipping your hand. You can tip your hat, but that's something different. Without tipping your hand,
like how do you do? Or like giving you congratulations or something. Yes.
Without saying how do you do, what are your thoughts on the beer? Right? Because I mean, we haven't really talked about it that much. I think Andrew had an offhand comment like, "Oh, that's a refreshing beer" or something like that. But
it's clearly a good 4.9% without you two are already flubbing idioms.
Hey, listen, I've been flipping idioms since the beginning of the Rampant Discourse podcast. This is nothing new. Okay, this is totally on brand for me.
100% your milieu.
Yeah, milieu. Well, look at you. It's a German beer, not a French beer.
Fine. I don't know how to say that in German.
It's probably milieu. No, that sounds French too.
Wow, there goes our French audience.
So yeah, I mean, what do you guys think? I mean, so I'll go first. I mean, I think it's a very light beer. In pretty much all the different meanings of the word. I didn't check the calorie count, but I mean, light in terms of flavor, light in terms of color, not heavy in my stomach or anything like that. Light in terms of alcohol content, I feel like. Um, I wasn't terribly impressed by it, but it's an easy drink, right? Like I could easily see myself knocking back a couple of these and not feeling too heavy, and so that's a positive. Kind of crisp and refreshing, kind of like Andrew had said at the beginning, like these light beers are gonna be a little crisper. Maybe I'm making this up. I think that's what he said. So that yeah, that's kind of my first impressions as I say with this much left.
I have no calorie count on my
Yeah,
can here,
let's
so I
see.
don't know how much it is. I was actually hoping to see that because I wanted to compare, because the purpose of a light beer is to reduce calories, and I suspect that this is full calorie, so we're probably going to be 150 calories per serving, and this is probably a 1.5 to 2 serving beer.
And to your point, yeah, I don't see any calories on here,
So,
but to your point, it does say that the ingredients are water, barley, malt, and hops.
yep. I saw that when he was talking about it. And it's
Yeah,
in like 5 different languages too.
yeah.
The
Stupid
Germans are
EU.
very, very serious about this, and it's one of the things that sort of goes with the Germans who have emigrated elsewhere and produce beers in other countries. If you have a German-founded brewery or a brewery in a German, heavily expat German area, they're going to have beers that tend to follow these rules, even if they're not required anymore, because it's just so baked into the culture.
And then one last question for this beer maybe is you'd mentioned so this is the oldest brewery in the world or
Oldest
in
privately
Germany?
owned brewery in the world is what they claim. Now, there's some dispute about this. I put it with an asterisk because even looking at the quick research, it's like, yeah, this may not be true, but they're definitely up there. There's
Well,
not many that have been around as long as them.
okay. Probably also depends what you mean by private, right? Because if there's like monks still brewing beer from like
Which,
the 800s, are they privately owned or not? Like,
and that may be something I talk about in another day. The fact that this is a Schloss brewery does distinguish it from the private breweries in a more modern system, even though this is a privately owned brewery at this point.
yeah,
So where do we
pretty much everything.
stand?
Well, I was about to say pretty much everything you said, Paul. Yeah, I mean it's a light, crisp Hellas lager.
The hoppiness came on strong early. It's faded. The head dissipates pretty quickly. It is solid all around. I don't know that this is going to make it into the list of my favorite beers, but it is a very appropriate, refreshing beer to have as a beer on its own, rather than necessarily with something.
And I think it's probably a good day one beer for this excursion. I'm guessing it's like a wine tasting where it's going to get darker and darker as you go.
I wouldn't necessarily count on that, but I do hope so.
Have we all finished our glasses?
We have.
All right. Do we
Woo!
want to give our official thumbs up, thumbs down? Do we have a clever gimmicky name for this? Yay, nay, no? Just thumbs up and thumbs down. Just gladiator style, like
It's
does it live or
gladiator
does it die?
style.
All right. On the count of three. Align with your cameras. All right. 1, 2, 3. Oh, look at that. It's unanimous. Thumbs up. Yeah,
Very.
I mean, I was not super impressed by it, but for what it is, like Andrew said, I prefer more darker beers, heavier beers, more flavorful. But for what it was very non offensive and kind of crisp and refreshing. And it's something that I could easily see myself having a few of.
Light beers get accused of not having enough flavor. This one still had enough flavor. Didn't mention the fact that on the can cover there's this grumpy looking fellow, and they call this the grumpy German Helles. So I'm not entirely sure why it's grumpy, but that's their branding.
Because he's German.
It doesn't seem particularly grumpy to me. It doesn't attack you except for that initial sip where it was a little hoppier than I expected. But it's still a fine beer, and as long as you are meeting the quality standards, which this one does, you're going to probably get a thumbs up for me.
Just one of my closing remark on that is it's interesting to keep saying it tasted hoppy because relative to a lot of the microbreweries here in America, this wasn't very hoppy at all.
No. Again, comparing it to an IPA would be
Yeah.
completely inappropriate. This is not a hoppy beer like an IPA, but for
Right.
a lager, it's again, especially considering the fact that we're probably going to have people who are expecting a Budweiser. This is going to be much stronger than your Budweiser. but it's a Budweiser replacement where you're looking for something with a little more excitement.
All right. So, well, I hope you all enjoyed this episode of our German Austrian Brewer Advent Calendar, and I hope you'll join us for day 2. Can't stop the discourse.